Poverty. The gut answer to that question is simple: having a low income. But income lowness, or having a lower cash income in relation to those around you, isn't always an accurate way to measure how poor someone is. For example, person A might make slightly more money than person B. But if person A also has a lot of medical bills due to a heart condition, they are more than likely to not have enough income to meet their needs. This is called income inadequacy. However, we don't think that poverty can be defined in a solely quantitative way, which is where functionings and capabilities come in. Defined by economist Amartya, functionings are the things that a person does and is in leading a life, while capabilities are a person's ability to achieve those functionings. To explain this, Sen uses the example of fasting versus starving. A person who is fasting and a person who is starving both fail to achieve the functioning of being well nourished. However, the person who is fasting has the capability or choice to be well nourished. They choose not to utilize their resources, while the person who is starving does not have that choice and therefore lacks the capability. This shows that poverty isn't solely the deprivation of income, but it is also the deprivation of choice. Using Sen's capability approach, we define poverty as a state in which a person's capabilities are restricted to a point at which they cannot achieve the basic functionings necessary for a dignified life. So, what is necessary to live a dignified life? Building on Sen's work, Martha Nussbaum outlines 10 central capabilities: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions and feelings, practical reason, affiliation and relationships, nature, play, and control over one's environment both politically and materialistically. We'll dive into a few of these. Bodily health is being able to be healthy and well nourished, as well as having sustainable shelter and clothing appropriate for the weather. One factor that can greatly influence bodily health is bodily integrity, which is another capability. This encompasses one's ability to move freely, have sovereignty over their own body, and remain free from assault of any kind. Additionally, the option to engage in the use of these senses, imagination, and thought is very important for the ability to have experiences, seeking meaning, and to feel self-advanced. And affiliation is the ability to be a part of a society and identify it with others. This is crucial to a person's well-being. The capabilities definition of poverty is quasi-relative, meaning that it falls somewhere between an absolute measure, in which one doesn't consider inequality, viewing that each person has without regard for what others have, and a relative measure, in which a person's poverty is solely defined in relation to what people have around them. This is because some capabilities, such as affiliation, take into account the situation of others, but capabilities such as bodily integrity are always absolute.
When it comes to measuring poverty, there are a few approaches to consider. The first is the Official Poverty Measure, or OPM, which is the official way the U.S. measures poverty. It was created in 1963 when Molly Garshansky, drawing on then-current data saying that the average household spent one-third of its budget on food, calculated the cost of a basic food plan and multiplied that cost by 3. If a person's income falls below that figure, they're classified as poor. Because it is simple and absolute, meaning that it doesn't factor in inequality, viewing what each person has without regard for what others have, the OPM is a convenient way to determine poverty. However, there are significant flaws. The OPM treats poverty as a strictly monetary phenomenon. It doesn't account for the growing cost of other necessities like housing and medical care that make up a much larger portion of the average household budget now than they did in 1963. In-kind benefits or the cost of living in certain regions is more, meaning that a person in NYC needs more money to meet their basic needs than a person in rural Kentucky does. So their thresholds for poverty should be different. The Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM, was created to solve some of those problems. To fix these shortcomings, the SPM is calculated with a new formula. An income threshold is set at one-third of the median expenditures for food, clothing, shelter, and utilities in a particular area, plus a nominal amount for other necessities like soap. To analyze an individual household, total cash income plus the cash value of in-kind benefits like food stamps minus non-discretionary expenditures like taxes and transportation to work are calculated. If the resulting figure falls below this FCSU-based threshold, a household is considered poor. The SPM is an improvement, but it shares with the OPM a fundamental problem. It still only views poverty in terms of a given monetary value. Under the definition of poverty that we determined in Part 1, money plays a role, but what we're really concerned with is the deprivation of capabilities. But how can we measure capabilities when they don't have a numerical value? The solution is to find a proxy that can be measured with numbers. For example, using life expectancy to measure the capability to live a long and healthy life. The Human Development Index utilizes this approach. The HDI attempts to measure capabilities by measuring three key dimensions of human development: long and healthy life, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. The proxies it relies on are gross national income, life expectancy, expected years of school, and actual years of school. This is an improvement upon the OPM and SPM because it doesn't measure poverty solely in terms of economic figures. However, there are flaws. Each of the three dimensions uses only a single indicator, making the scope limited. And the indicator used for living standards is GNI per capita, a measure that isn't as accurate in countries like the US with massive inequality. Also, since the GNI is used, it can really only be used to compare one country to another, not measure poverty in individuals. Which brings us to our best and final measurement of poverty, the Multidimensional Poverty Index. Developed by the Oxford Poverty and Development Initiative in the UN in 2010, the MPI uses the same three dimensions as the HDI, but utilizes two indicators each for health and education dimensions, and 6 for living standards, none of which include the unreliable GNI. The best thing about the UN's MPI is that because it was designed in part as a framework to aid individual countries in the development of national MPIs, it is incredibly flexible, leaving policymakers the freedom to substitute indicators that are more relevant to life in their own countries. So an example of a US MPI could look something like this. Substituting child mortality for life expectancy makes more sense because of lower rates of child mortality in the U.S. compared to many of the countries the UN uses the MPI to measure. Therefore, measuring it in the U.S. wouldn't be as indicative of health conditions as life expectancy would be. While measuring the standards of living by substituting the indicators for an income of at least one-third the median regionally adjusted cost of FCSU allows us to easily account for the differences in the regional cost of living that may be harder to measure under the UN's indicators. A US MPI would be especially useful because it can show us which indicator is contributing the most to poverty, paving the way for targeted public policy solutions. The main drawback to the MPI is the amount of data it requires, but in developed and industrialized countries like the United States, this shouldn't be a significant barrier. So, poverty. It's not just about having a low income. It's about lacking the capabilities to achieve basic functionings that one needs in order to live a dignified life. And the way that we measure poverty should reflect that, which is why a US-adjusted MPI is the best way to measure poverty in America.